everyone. Welcome to the Cārvāka podcast. This is your host, kushalmehra. All right, my guest today is Dr. Deepti Navaratna. She is a musician, neuroscientist, and author. And today we're going to be talking about her book, The Maverick Maharaja. This is a biography of Maharaja Jayachamarajendra Wadiyar, and it is my absolute pleasure to have her on the podcast. Thank you very much and welcome.
Thank you so much. Namaste to all those of you who have gathered here digitally and on various platforms. Thank you so much for inviting me. Happy to be here.
So now I have to ask you that. So if you don't mind, we'll get into the book. But so background in neuroscience, and I was reading a little bit. So you want your website says you want to explore a new interdisciplinary direction in music performance research and cultural entrepreneurship, and you've mentioned neuroscience. Can we talk a little bit about that if you don't mind?
Yeah,
Because that's like
absolutely.
something I'm interested in.
Sure.
So like how does neuroscience get into this?
Well, it doesn't. At least in the scope of the book, it doesn't. But it's sort of, I imagine my engagement with arts and culture, music, and the science as a unitarian journey, as a unifying journey, as a journey towards singularity, not in the artificial intelligence parlance. And also, if you look at so sort of taking an Indic perspective on that, if one looks at the iconography of Saraswati, she's holding the japamala in one hand. She's holding the sometimes holding the shuka pustaka veena manimala alankritam. This is how the Maharaja himself describes Saraswati in one of his krutis. So there's through these iconographies, she's definitely wielding the veena, the symbol of creative expression. So all of these iconographies in our culture talk about the multifacetedness, the multi dimensionality of knowledge. And so I'm not satisfied simply singing the music. I'm very much interested in researching about it, trying to find out who we are, why we are, and how we got here, and why do we sing ragas and not. I mean, why do we find joy in creating and enjoying ragas as opposed to symphonies? And that's where the neuroscientist steps in, and perhaps probing into the psyche of multifaceted personalities like the Maharaja, who was a polymath. My training in the psychological aspects of neuroscience gives me a slight edge into understanding the maverick manodharma, if you will. And so, neuroscience, music, arts, culture, research, performance, cultural entrepreneurship, and now cultural diplomacy. That's my new pet peeve. So, all of these things coalesce into one gigantic jigsaw puzzle that I call my career orientation and journey. So, um,
Yeah.
and I
So
find great pleasure in that multidimensional path towards excellence, seeking excellence.
But don't you think it is kind of appropriate in today's world where interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary approaches to finding truths is the requirement of the day? Because if even if we look at academia today, whether in the West or in India, academia is slowly. I mean, there is always going to be academic orthodoxy, and I'm not saying this in a pejorative way or necessarily. The academia tends to believe in field based speciality, and sometimes there is a little bit of resistance in an interdisciplinary approach where you like to dabble a little bit across the place. But it's good. I'm actually glad. In fact, I was checking out your as part of my research, I try to do and try to understand my guests as much as I can, because uh, a lot of times people don't realize that the first time I'm actually speaking with my guest is when they come live on the podcast. So I have to do all my research. I have to go back and watch their interviews, if as many as possible. And luckily with you have interviews online, so I could go and check out where you're coming from. But now to get into the book, so why did you decide to say write a book on this particular family and this particular personality, and why the title, the Maverick Maharaja?
Yeah. Well, the book was a beautiful accident. While I was at the New England Conservatory in England, um, I was looking for musical examples from the past, which had these East meets West encounters, where there was a fertile crossover of ideas, syntax, vocabulary, and jargon from, like, Western music into Indian classical music, or Western genres which have crossed over into Indian genres, and Indian ideas which have crossed over into the European art music scenario. And then there's this popular perception that this happened in the George Harrison Beatles era, right? You may think I'm a dreamer, but I'm not. But then there were dreamers before John Lennon, and many of those dreamers, interestingly, were situated in Mysore. It was strange that I discovered a whole new facet to Mysore sitting far away, far, far away in Boston. And I realized that some of these very fertile musical encounters happened in the Mysore court, which had a full fledged Western orchestra and new music. Very fertile intercultural encounters happened in Mysore, not in the 19th century, but in the 18th century and the 19th century. And that some of these relics of these intercultural encounters are still continuing. For example, the Mysore police department has a police band which plays this music even today. So these are fascinating living traditions, which give you a small little glimpse into this mystical, magical past, if you will. And so that's how I chanced upon the music of the Maharaja. And because the Maharaja Jayachamarajendra Wadiyar had written exclusively for the band, combining Western musical syntax with Carnatic ragas and kritis and so on, I was drawn to his music. I was fascinated by his music, that somebody could actually imagine a whole new idiom. And then I got fascinated with the personality, because music can really, really mirror a person's psyche in ways that nothing else can. And so I began writing about his music, and I decided that, his life is fascinating enough, and that this story has not been told. There was no biography of the man. And while we were growing up in Bengaluru, I was born and raised in Bengaluru, and so I've done my share of mugging up the history textbooks to, like, get passing marks. The man was always the fill up the blanks question. I sort of remember him as the last Maharaja of Mysore. That was the place that our history as written and enjoyed at that point in time, had accorded him. And so there was so much more to his personality, and so much of a international impact the man had during his time and period. And I was quite intrigued initially that nobody had actually written about him in English, and a full on biography for, national or international consumption. And sort of I tiptoed myself into his life, and found myself completely consumed by the man and his polymath genius, and decided to do another crossover into history and biography, and donning the role of a biographer, which is a very complicated place to be in for various reasons.
So if you don't mind me dabbling a little bit more into this music bit, as you said, Western music being influenced by the East and East being influenced by the West. um, you obviously are a professionally trained singer, musician. You understand this. So, and very rarely do my guests have the opportunity. My guests are people who are from a musical background. I mean, I've had Ram Sampath, I have Sonam Mohapatra on the podcast. So
Right.
so whenever I get people who are way more skilled than I am, obviously I try to make the most of it. So I'm going to take this opportunity and nerd out a little bit. Can you share some examples and explain to my viewers and listeners what exactly do we mean when we say A type of music is being influenced by B? And I don't care if you have to sing or you don't have to sing. I'm not saying you have to. I'm just saying, please explain this, because it is very important. Like I don't know how else to say it. Like I get very nerdy when I listen to these things. Like I was like, wonder what has happened. So can you explain this a little more?
Yeah. There is this thing called the Mysore State Anthem. And in fact, that was that can be considered the very first East meets West intercultural experiment. When Jayachamarajendra Wadiyar's grandfather, Chamaraja Wadiyar the 10th, was actually restored on the Mysore crown, they wanted an anthem for Mysore. There was always the anthem for the king, the emperor, and they wanted a benediction which would actually evoke uh, those very sentiments for the Raja. Because after a short hiatus, the Raja had come back on the throne, and Mysore was being restored to the warriors. And so Basavappa Shastri, a Kannada poet, pens lyrics in Kannada, in chaste Kannada. Kayau Shri Gauri Karuna Lahari Toya Jakshi Shankarishwari. It is as if you just look at the lyrics, you can imagine that being sung in a quaint temple in Mysore. But instead, this is tuned in an Ionian scale, what is called an Ionian scale in Western parlance. And the melody was tuned by a bandmaster called Mr. Bartels to a double duplex meter. So you can, if I sing this, which I will, thank you for. I always like to open my mouth to sing. Sing more and speak less if that's possible, but it's not always possible. So you can. This is a march band actually. So the Kaya Shri Gauri Karuna Lahari Toya Jakshi Shankarishwari, that thing becomes actually a march, a band driven music piece. And then you can actually imagine a band going rum chak chak rum chak chak underneath this. So since I don't have a band here, I'll just try my best to sort of show you what I mean. Kayo Shri Gauri Karuna Lahari Kayo Shri Gauri Karuna Lahari Toya Jakshi Shankarishwari Toya Jakshi Shankarishwari Shri Jaya Chamundike Shri Jaya Chamendra Namankita Bhumindra Lalamana Mudade Kayo Shri Gauri Karuna Lahari. So you can actually imagine this being played by a march band in front of Buckingham Palace. You can actually hear this ram chak chak ratata ratata rapapam ratatam ratatatam tam ratatam
Yeah,
tatam.
I actually get it because I used to play drums, so I could actually relate to what you're
Yeah,
saying immediately.
this is arranged for a full scale band with the brass band and the trombones howling and the cymbals going rap on the on the high beats of the music. um so yeah so these ideas of a benediction get and melded with the idea of a march band, and most importantly with the idea of state pageantry, right? Even today at the Mysore Dasra, which is a fairly religious congregation, you will find these men sporting fairly Western costumes straight from Buckingham Palace playing these, march tunes today. And there's a reason that they are doing that for Chamundi.
So, so as a musician, again, sorry about the follow up. Um,
No.
so the Western singing style and the creative style, if I try to understand it, it has less scope of maneuvering and experimentation in comparison to the Indian style. And you being a trained classical singer, so who better to ask this question than a trained classical singer? So how does one do the blending then? Because like in classical singing, from
Yeah.
what I have understood, is like I have seen interviews where the musicians playing with, say, for example, Bhimsen Joshi, have to adjust to what he's doing. He doesn't adjust to what they are doing. So they are like,
Yes, yes.
okay, if he goes left, we go left. If he goes right, we go right. And it is all spontaneous. So how does the Western pattern, which is very fixed, there are fixed chords, there are fixed sets, there are fixed beats, everybody follows a pattern. How does
Yeah.
the East meet the Western?
You're so right. Although on paper, the idea seems very romantic, right? East meets the West, and our raga meets symphony, Beethoven meets, Dikshitar, and Tyagaraja meets Debussy, and all of that. But they're highly incompatible systems at their very core identities. For example, raga music is rooted in monophony, like you can't harmonize a raga. And then for a symphonic form, harmony tonality is at its very root. So, and then in terms of complexity, let's look at these systems in just in terms of complexity. While the symphonic form believes in layers and layers of music which are packed one on top of each other, so complexity is explored at the level of the level of the vertical. Sometimes a trombone is just doing pop, 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 pop. And then there's a violin that is soaring like on top of that, and the operatic voice may be doing fairly simple maneuvers on top of it. But as a whole, that vertical slice of music comes out as extraordinarily sophisticated and complex. But in the Carnatic ensemble, which has only three layers, typically the voice, the mridangam, and of course, there's Mr. Drone Box, who's always like, telling you where to go and all of that. And then the violinist, who sometimes is always echoing what the voice is singing. So he's not really bringing new nuances to the whole table. So in this trio of sorts, complexity is the same level of complexity is achieved by the soloist doing all the gymnastics. So there's more room in the Indian classical milieu for the soloist to explore more complexity at the level of like vocal techniques. For example, that's why our compositions, like if you take a Tagaraja composition, Kamalapta Kula, on one word, Kamalapta Kula is your first statement. Kamalapta Kula Kalashabdi Chandra. There's more room for the vocalist to develop the musical idea at the level of the line, at the level of, more sangatis as they're called in music. And for this complexity to emerge horizontally than vertically in a symphonic form. I think that's sort of the both forms have the same level of complexity, but they achieve it in various directions and in various dimensions. So if you put them together, it is hard or as much as it's a romantic escapade, it's very hard for that anthropomorphic musical creature to live somewhere, right? Is the hardest. If you create a new hybrid, that musical hybrid has to have its own identity which neither lives here or there. And how creatively one is able to create this new hybrid is a testament to his musical genius. So that's why there have been very few successful experiments with despite this whole uh, hula bula boo about like, oh, east meets west. um, well, some of the Carnatic fusion is just simply substitutions. You would remove the mridangam with and put a drum in its place, and then you remove the tambura and then simply add chords to it, which is really no real innovation, right? Because you're simply substituting instruments, but they say play the same roles in the ensemble. So it's
So
a hard
basically,
sell.
what you're trying to say is the singing is not changing because the singing is the same. You're just changing the sound in the back, right? So it's just what the mridangam would sound. You've just replaced it with a drum kit, and it's nothing is really changing. And I get it. Yeah, I can get it. I'm not into singing, but I understand playing instruments, so I could actually understand what you're saying there.
Shakti, for that matter, take Shakti. Shakti is so Carnatic dominated. It is actually Carnatic driven, right? Akriti drives every single piece in that album. While people take some glorious solos and all of that and sort of harmonize it, it's really difficult. And all the music of European art composers who say they have composed with Indian inspirations, for example, the I think it is Deepasi's Indian Fantasy. If you listen to those pieces, I don't find any Indianness in them. So, like I said, those hybrids have to live somewhere, and then that's the challenge with these East meets West experimentations. But it's good. I'm all for experimentation because nature believes in recombination. Nature believes in moving forward. Nature believes in all kinds of enveloping non-enveloping creativity. So some experiments will fail, some experiments will live on, some experiments will become mainstream, like the violin in Carnatic music. It was an experiment one at one point in time, and it's now the mainstream. So
So one fascinating thing about the Maharaja, I like to read a bit from your book, is that you say this Maverick Maharaja dreamt of minting reams of pedantic papyrus. He curated the only translation of the terse 10,552 mantras of the Rig Veda Sanhita to Kannada, so his people could access that treasure. So if it was not for him, we would not have this, literally.
literally. And another
Oh.
backstory to that is he did this after he stepped down the throne of Mysore. It is as if he was fulfilling his Raja Dharma even after he actually had officially signed it off. And it's these vignettes that make his story very, very heartwarming. And see, we are sold and told this sort of story. We're sold this perception that royalty in the colonial era, where this monolithic perception that they were all vain people who really had no real significance either for their own kingdoms or for India or for the globe at large. But once that veil of dismissal is shattered, you will find that this soil has produced quality leadership even during the colonial era. It's not enough to simply sit and cry foul that our history textbooks today are full of stories of invaders and infidels. It's more important to bring these stories out so that it is there. The untarnished truth is there for people to see and to challenge that notion that these princely lives were. Were simply, stooges of the British Empire, vassals who sold away their dignity to appease the white man and did nothing for the welfare of their subjects. And see, the idea of Rajadharma again keeps coming back. See, Padmanabha Dasa, Martanda Varma said, I am Padmanabha Dasa. Even the crown has the padukas of Padmanabha Swami. And then even today, that family is defending faith, right? It's defending the Padmanabha Swami temple. Similarly, many of these kings, I'm not saying everybody, many of these kings, even after they were dethroned, continued to defend and preserve and curate and fight for the preservation of our culture, our Indian knowledge systems, our music, and also of the general idea of what a plural society should be, and how that plurality, their notion of plurality is interesting. And it is along the lines of what Swami Vivekananda said in his speech at the Parliament of World Religions. This is the land, even when there was no constitution of India, that has welcomed so many religious minorities and embraced a plural society with no legal, hold that required it to do so. So how these people have strived and showed certain kinds of cultural, social, and what do you say, leadership of a very different kind to create inclusive, quote unquote, inclusive societies which could embrace plurality not as a problem but as a fantastic opportunity. I think that's the shining moment in these stories. The Mysore band, for that matter, had Christians, had Muslims, had Jews, had North Indians, had South Indians, had, Germans, refugees from World War I. It was, and what Mysore managed to create in that time and space is a fascinating story. Maybe it has a lot of messages for us today in how we would like to lead and grow into that kind of a society where you really need not have to divorce your roots to actually embrace the current.
So I it's only fair that, I mean, you did mention it in a passing reference, because that is something of a charge laid at the Wadiyars about being British Stooges. I mean, I have to ask, otherwise I would be doing an unfair job as a person who's discussing this subject about a Maharaja, because there has been significant historical charges against the family about being British Stooges. And I'll go even one step further, where Tipu Sultan is shown in a particular light, and the Wadiyar family is shown in a particular light. Now, uh, how do we deal with that subject? I mean, I don't know how else to say it. Like, how does one deal with the subject? Because when I read your book, to me, four strands of the Maharaja come across. One is a polymath, as you rightly said, a voracious reader, a reader and a writer, someone who consumes a lot, someone who dabbles a lot in philosophy, which is my subject. I love philosophy, right? I am obsessed with philosophy. That is something. And his way of looking at the world through, i i I would, I don't want to be unfair, but it looks like a primarily Advaitin worldview, in my opinion.
Yes.
He has a Advaitin worldview, because from whatever, because I started, once I read your book, then I went to level. That's why I took so much time, because people don't realize ki, why do I take so much time to do one book review? Because then I read the book, and then I do my fact checking of the book, and then I start reading more about the book. I got interested in the Maharaja. I read a few things of the Maharaja, and I understood, okay, Maharaja has a Advaitin worldview. The third is his deep knowledge of music, which we already covered in the first half. Now, in such a issue, where do you think have things gone wrong, that none of this, sa- like these aspects of the Maharaja have not come out, but only that he's a British stooge has come out?
Yeah, I mean, there are two reasons. History is always a perception game, like we just discussed, right? And colonial history is exceedingly written by history is handmaiden of the hands that actually document that part of history. So, um, Tipu Sultan was very important to the British memory, right? Because he challenged the he actually sort of scared the hell out of their need to conquer India completely. So he was very important to British memory. But maybe it's time to think whether he is as important to our memory today, right now. And it's okay to Tipu's contested history, Tipu's contested legacy. It's okay to recontest and re-examine and deconstruct and reconstruct old histories. And if we want to do that of Tipu's history, it is also fine to do that, as long as the unvarnished truth is is exposed, and all aspects of the may all aspects of the truth be exposed all at once. But I also feel that um, stories like these, which do not fall on the fault lines of history, right? The Maharaja was a good guy, was a philosopher, was a serious polymath. He his gifts to India, for example, the Wadiyar kings gave India so many of the national laboratories. The history of science in South India is so inextricably linked to uh, the Wadiyar legacy. For example, Vani Vilas Sannidhana, the regent queen, actually gave permission to start the Indian Institute of Science, and which the Maharaja furthered and added the aeronautical engineering department and so on. The HAL story, the Hindustan Aeronautics Limited, the Maharaja started Hindustan Aeronautics Limited, which sort of kick-started the defense aerospace industry for India, not just for Mysore, and also was a key player in India winning this World War II. Mysore had not only sent men and resources, but also innovated technologically so that the Japanese occupation of India did not become a reality. Mysore sent a whole squadron called the Mysore Squadron of jets, called the Mysore Squadron, which fought uh, for British India. And all those workhorses were serviced here in Bengaluru at the HAL. So these contributions to, like, to India and at large are not small. The National Tuberculosis Institute, the Central Food Technological Research Institute, these are all national laboratories, and they are not housed in Bengaluru and Mysuru by any stroke of luck. So here is a story of a man who was himself a math polymath, was a philosopher, wrote books on the Advaita Vedanta, and gave several gifts, sovereign souvenirs, and gifts to the nation. To sell this story, I've realized, because it does not fall on the fault lines of history, like, is very, to sell this story or to tell this story is very difficult, because it is not TRP worthy in so many ways. Because I've realized it's very difficult to sell a good story. It's very difficult to tell the story of a man whose virtue was faultless. It's very easy to tell the story that lies on these fault lines of whether, Tipu was good or bad. People love binaries. History loves binaries.
Hmm.
But truth is always gray. It's some shade of gray. Um,
Yeah, it is true. Can we talk about this bit? I just want to read this excerpt here. You say the monist philosophies of Advaita Vedanta and the oldest and the most premier school of Vedanta anchored the mind of JCW. He was a Sri Vidya Upasaka, an ardent student of the practice of Sri Vidya, which
yeah.
imparts knowledge of the self through an alchemy of Tantra, Mantra, and Yantra. In his life, one finds a shining example of how religious practice can engineer a mind that's capable of transcending the binaries of reason and faith as understood by the West. The core ideas of Western Enlightenment were built around the centrality of thought and reason. It believed in the absolutism of evidence of the senses, of observation and inference as primary sources of gaining knowledge. Now, what exactly did the Maharaja say when it came to understanding and conser- garnering knowledge?
Yeah, in this chapter, I call him a bhogi of knowledge. The Maharaja had one big vice. He had an insatiable urge for knowledge, and he gambled avidly with his very many faculties to, like, always he was always a seeker of knowledge. In fact, I'd like to sort of read um, this quote, which is there in the foreword, written by his daughter, Maharaj Kumari Srimati Indrakshi Devi Wadiyar. He says it's very interesting to note how he looks at himself. He was a pedigree king, he was many things, but it's very interesting to see how he himself perceived his role and his place in space. So he says, several positions of honor and dignity I have held in my life as a result of the circumstances of my birth. But there is one position, one destiny I have carved out for myself, and that is as a student, shall I say, an advanced student of literature, history, philosophy, music, and above all, our ancient culture, which illuminates my path and which serves as a perpetual refreshment for my mind and soul. So, that sort of fully encapsulates how he placed himself in the larger milieu of things, and the Raja Dharma, or his role as the administrator or a statesman on top of the Mysore Gaddi, was just, he saw as one of the many roles that he was born to fulfill. He was not the crown. And that's why I write in the very beginning that it's not very often that the man emerges from the shadows of the crown. How many biographies of Maharajas are beyond the crown? That's another interesting point. When Mysore exited his world, right? So um, it's as if when Mysore exited his world, he was only 30. But for 10 years, as a 20-year-old lad, he was thrust on the Mysore throne. And for 10 years, through the one of the worst political times for both Mysore and India, he was on the Mysore throne. And when Mysore exited his world, it's as if multiple avatars rose in his life. He's somewhat freed from the burdens of being a statesman and running the state. And he decides to like sort of resuscitate the Filhar. He does very, very anachronistic things. And that's why I call him the Maverick. The time and place and the way in which he did what he did, that's what makes him a maverick. It is not the sum total of the things he achieved in his very short life of 55 years. But once he was freed from Mysore, he said, "Oh yeah, and many many avatars rose. He was a benefactor. He resuscitated the orchestra scene in London, founded something called the Philharmonia Society, not in Mysore but in London, which continues to play today as the Philharmonia Orchestra." And he wrote about the Advaita Vedanta. He furiously composes 100 compositions and never looks back, did not even bother to document them. He was more bothered about saving the legacies of other musicians in Mysore and abroad. And decided that he wants to be a cultural ambassador, wants to write and lecture all over the globe about Sanatana Dharma, about Indic values. He was one of the founders of the Vishwa Hindu Parishad. Another lesser known fact is that some of the very early meetings of Vishwa Hindu Parishad, its mandate and all of that, was chalked out at the Mysore Palace with the financial assistance and mm, blessings of the Maharaja. So he did all of this. And the interesting thing is the fact that he was a very religious man. He was a very religious man. The Sri Vidya, like I said, the Sri Vidya Upasana provided him with the key to tide over his turbulent times. So I'm sorry, I'm sort of launching into very long monologues here, but see, I'll take a short segue here, sorry. Aristotle did not believe in the idea of a philosopher king because he thought the idea of a thinking man is really antagonistic to the idea of a king who's supposed to be all brute and testosterone, right? Plato's philosopher king was rejected by many people, although Alexander the Great, who um, who calls himself a philosopher king, was supposedly a bhakt of Aristotle. So the Western world has actually battled with this idea of a philosopher king. But in India, we've had a huge long list of kings who used philosophy to anchor their soul, who used philosophy to show them the way. Who else but the king needs philosophy more than, right, more than anybody else? The king's mind, the king's psyche, the king's atman needs ways to uh, meet the Brahman, right? um, so in the Maharaja's life, his practice of the Sri Vidya also powered his creative offerings. All of his music is about the Devi and his journey with the Sri Vidya. It also gave him this requisite separation to let go of Mysore and to tide those circumstances. It's a story of will over destiny, and to do what is best without an over attachment to one single role as a statesman and as a king. So in fact, when he's asked about, how did it feel to let go of, uh, I was just at the Mysore Palace the other day, and then I was just walking away from the Mysore Palace, and I am just a commoner, and as I was walking away, I thought what it would have meant to simply walk away from that riches, from that splendor and glory, and to walk away like that. Only an Avadhuta can do that and do it with grace. And so um, I write that, what use is music if the song is not heard within, right? What's the use of philosophy if it does not give the man, the philosopher, the tools to tide over his circumstances gracefully and beautifully, and create an alchemy of opportunity? And that's exactly what the Maharaja did. When Mysore exited, he said, great, I'm now going to be a freemason of my own destiny, and did whatever he wanted to do. He decided to take up this Rig Veda Samhita project. 15 years. There is no other translation of the Rig Veda Samhita in any other vernacular language other than Kannada. It took 15 years of so many hands and minds to do that. It is a Herculean task. It is a mammoth project that was completed by the Maharaja fully on his expense, and it's available for the Kannadigas to access the divine knowledge um, of our knowledge system. So those things, somebody who's unconditionally, as I write in the book, somebody who's unconditionally hell bent on being himself first, gaddi or not, that to me
Yep.
sounds like a maverick. And somebody who's, see, the fact that he was a religious man, believed in Hinduism, did not prevent him from appreciating the beauty of a symphonic form which had no metaphors or symbolism of Hindu life. So it's that very beautiful, rooted in one's dharma, rooted in one's culture. But then looking at the incoming, not as a problematic, you know, irritation, but as something that presents a beautiful opportunity to grow
I
into
get it.
something beautiful. Yeah.
I get it. But you use the word Avadhuta again. I want to read this bit in his lecture Avadhuta Reason and Reverence and the Indian Institute of for World Culture.
Yeah.
JCW describes the equanimous state of an Avadhuta thus, quote, he is described as a pure sinless, aesthetically balanced bhogi enjoyer of lives. And obviously, you say Sudat Niranjana Samarasa Bhogi. This indicates that the Avadhuta is adept in the art of life. His fascination with the concept of an Avadhuta was perhaps because it was a philosophy closest to his reality. The Avadhuta Gita gave him the recipe to enjoy his royal material bhogas while consuming the redeeming spirituality of the arts, music, and literature. Most importantly, it contextualized his incessant bhoga of knowledge, which he did in great amounts throughout his life. Now, a lot of people may not know this fact that when India got its independence from the British, and obviously when the princely states were Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel and the Indian government went one by one. Mysore was one of the first states that basically pretty much said, "Okay, we're part of India," right?
Yes. Yes. In fact, that landslide of the princely states taking this idea of an instrument of accession was triggered by Mysore's signing and Maharaja's signing the instrument of accession, because there were many, many princely states, very small princely states. There were these big five princely states: Mysore, Baroda, um, Gwalior. So these princely states were the big five princely states, and they wanted several of them to actually kickstart this um, landslide towards sort of creation of this Indian Union, because back then the idea of a Balkan India, right, was looming large. For many of us really do not know, and I also did not know until I did in-depth research, was that India had elections even before we formally declared independence, right? And there were many princely kingdoms who were wanting to join Pakistan, and they were, and what was, not Pakistan then, but they were planning to join the other nation, and they were inside India. For example, Hyderabad, the Nizam of Hyderabad was not willing to join the Indian Union. So it was Patel and VP Menon who devised this gulpable pill called the instrument of accession. It was actually pure genius, I would say. But for that innovation, at that timely innovation at that point in time, we would have had a very different charter of history written out for us. So the instrument of accession was pure genius. They said, externalize defense, externalize your external affairs, and you will get autonomy to run your state. So from 1947 to 1950, the Maharaja was a sovereign. So there was a constitution of Mysore, which ran Mysore until the idea of the Indian Republic emerged in 1950. So that's when actually Mysore melded with the Indian Union, so to speak. And so this whole nation building story of Mysore melding into India, and JCW or Jayachamarajendra Wadiyar joining hands with Patel. He also gave his Mysore Dakota. It was his magic carpet. So it was his personal jet, and he gave it to Sardar Patel. It put it at his disposal, and Patel used it extensively to fly to all of the princely states and get consensus on sort of the formation of the Indian Union. So there's this story, actually, there's this message by Patel also, where he says he had clocked several thousands of miles on the Mysore Dakota before he actually landed in Mysore. So he saw that as a very interesting thing, that he had never set foot in Mysore, but he had used the Mysore Dakota to fly all over India to create consensus for the Indian Union. And he is very, very thankful to the Maharaja for having done that on his own accord. Nobody asked him to, or there was no regulation that required him to do that.
Yeah, in
So,
fact, I want to read this. When asked how difficult it was to make the decision to give away his kingdom to the Indian Union, he replied, quote, I was inclined towards Vedanta almost right from my childhood. It was not at all difficult to change the new situation. We are all parts of Paramatma, the great soul, Vishwatma, the universal soul. This is ruling over us. Democracy is a practical application of this universal principle. By saying democracy is an application of the principle of Vishwatma, it is as if he stands on the shoulders of the men of enlightenment and the Advaita at once to come to this simple acceptance. Of what use is philosophy if it does not help men write their realities? And then you have obviously quoted him on his 37th birthday in his reply to an address presented to him by the Chief Minister on 29 July 1956. You have just mentioned it before that. You have referred in your address to what your generosity has termed my sacrifice. I do not look upon it as such. If destiny has decreed that over the past few centuries the progress and the prosperity of the people of this beloved state should be in the hands of the Wadiyars of Mysore, then that same destiny now ordains that the time is ripe for the people, now grown to full political stature in a free democratic republic, to rule themselves. The rule of the Maharajas has indeed fulfilled its purpose, the purpose of making the people fit to rule themselves. This is a very mature statement. this is
yep.
this is a very good statement. But now I have to talk about this. You mentioned this, and you mentioned Vikram also in the book. So you talk about the origin of Mysore Pak. Now let us settle this once and for all, because Anand Ranganathan and everybody seems to have an ongoing debate happening on Twitter right now. So what is
Mm.
the origin of Mysore Pak? Tell the story.
I think it originated as a quick fix recipe that was cooked up in a haste. That's at least that's the anecdotal story. I fail to remember the name of the chef who actually did that, and it was a huge hit with the royal family, and was prescribed to be part of the feast for several festivities. So, being a Mysorean, I'll say Jai Mysore. It was. It happened in Mysore. All roads lead to Mysore. Jai Chamundi. Yes.
So yeah, so in your book you say the legend has it that Mysore Pak the dessert as was an accidental success. Kakasura
Yes.
Madappa, the chief chef of Nalvadi Krishnaraja Wadiyar, on an occasion had to make a dessert rather quickly, mixing gram flour and ghee to a sugar paka concoction. The experimental Mysore Pak was presented with the royal thali, and it was an instant hit. Today, this Mysore Pak is sold to gourmets all over the world and is a standard staple in most meat stores. Like I don't know how to say this. This is such a like anticlimactical end to the whole story. I thought somebody must have sat down. Okay, let us try this. Let us try that.
No.
And this seems like, "Arey, jaldi karo. We have to find something." He wants to
झटपट
eat.
कुछ बना लो.
Yeah. So this is like, खोदा पहाड़ निकला चूहा जिसको बोलते हैं ना हिंदी में. And it's like, what the hell? When I read this part in your book, I was like, damn it, this is all the origin story is. I thought it must be some complex creation.
Yeah, no. And it's a case of sweet serendipity, actually. And that the fact that it sort of, was a hit with the royal gentry, and everybody was like, yeah, give me some of that. And so I'm with Vikram on this one. Uh, for
Yeah.
sure.
All right.
Uh,
So Okay, so let me now take a few questions, because there are a few questions that our viewers have asked also. So, someone has asked, Wadiyars trace their ancestry to Gujarat, Dwarka, Yaduvanshis. Is there a Gujarat connection in the music, just like Jaggery in Sambar, I guess somebody has written. So, do you know
Interesting.
about them?
Yeah, according to historians, there are sort of two stories on the origins of Wadiyar presence. One is that there were two brothers who came from Gujarat, and they were invited by the queen, who was wanting to slay one of the evil suitors of to her daughter. That's one story. So there is this. The other story is that the Wadiyar dynasty, or the two brothers who founded the Wadiyar dynasty, were actually from the Arsu community. There were several Dalavois, right? So the Vijayanagara Empire was a confederation of very many chieftains and generals and Dalavois, and the what do you say, the warrior communities, several warrior communities who used to collect taxes for the Vijayanagar Empire, and who functioned as local warlords and sometimes as kings. And so there was this presence of the Arsu Wadiyar uh, gentry in that area. And the other story is that they were localites who actually helped dethrone an evil usurper to the throne, and finally installed themselves on the throne after the fall of the Vijayanagar Empire. But there is a Gujarat connection, because there are many Gujarat connections. Chamaraja Wadiyar was great friends with, and Mysore and Baroda have this very interesting shared ancestry of leadership and preserving Indic culture. There's an Oriental Research Institute in Mysore. There's an Oriental Research Institute in Baroda. There are ties of friendship, ties of women given in marriage to each other's royal families. So Mysore and Baroda and Gujarat have there's a yeah, I forget the most obvious one. There is a Sayaji Rao Road in Mysore named on Sayaji Rao of Gaikwad of Baroda, and there is a Wadiyar Road that I think, if I'm not wrong, leads into the MS University today in Baroda. So they were great friends, and Mysore and Baroda mimicked their administrative ideas on democratic apparatuses. Universities, MS University was modeled on the Mysore University idea, and so on. So there's been a lot of give and take, and positive things that have happened in this road from Mysore to Baroda. There was also a big railway line, if I'm not wrong, that went from Mysore to Baroda, and Dharwad in Karnataka, being the cultural capital for Hindustani music, is perhaps because it was the stopover point of this railway line from Mysore to Baroda. So many things went on that line, I must say.
That's fascinating. That's fascinating. So the next question I want to ask is, someone has asked, in the Luru Paris, we see a lot of evidence of Wadiyar saving artifacts of Hinduism. How was the Maharaja's relation with, let's say, the Ligayats in Srirangapatnam and the Jain community? In your research, did you see inter-religious communication, or inter-panthic, if I was to use the correct word, inter-panthic communication, and how would the Maharaja deal in those with different panthas, if I was to say, or darshanas?
Ah, well, the JSS institution of the Lingayats in Mysore and Karnataka, the JSS Matha, the Sutur Matha, the place for it, and the royal family has always had a very intimate relationship and patronage that it has received. From the time of Krishnaraj Wadiyar to Jayachamarajendra Wadiyar, land grants were being given to establish these mathas. In fact, there is I really do not know about the links between the Jain community that is sort of stationed in the Shravana Belagula area to Mysore, but Mysore as a whole, um, the Mysore administration was patronizing all communities, inclusive of the Jews in in Mysore. the Christians, and such large land grants were given to all religious minorities in the Mysore state. So it is, like I said, it's an interesting case of how one can give excellent governance and embrace plurality in a very different positive idiom.
All right. So this question is more about, I guess, your music and neuroscience bit. So someone has asked, from your combined research on music and neuroscience, is there a way to increase neuronal myelination or IQ
Hmm.
by listening to certain types of music? Or I will add a little bit more to this. Do have they done, backward integration studies on uh, certain people who listen to certain music have certain inclinations or certain patterns of behavior?
What a brilliant question. Um, I think there is a book called Manasollasa, written by written a long time ago. I forget the century in which it was written. It was written by a king, which talks about how this the kind of music that you like. He actually does this reverse engineering. The kind of music that you like, what does it tell you about you? So so to sort of on the sort of to take a contrarian view, yes, musical immersion or engagement, listening to music, um, is not known to increase your myelination, because see, it's a passive activity. If you simply sit and listen to some music, it's highly unlikely that your myelination or your overall ability to like form new neuronal networks or enhance your cognitive foundations will be augmented. But if you actually do music, for example, if you create if you drum, if you play an instrument, if you actually would like to get your hands dirty and get to doing music making, singing, chanting, drumming, all of these activities, because they involve doing, they're active, they can actually trigger myelination, the formation of new neuronal circuits, which can alter the structurality of the brain for, let's say, higher IQ. um, because there were a short while ago there was this baby Mozart effect, right? You play Mozart to babies and the babies suddenly become very brilliant. So all of those myths have been debunked today, saying that simply listening to some music may increase your ability to sit in one place and attend to something, which is attentionality. But and that may have its own benefits. You may be able to, if you're able to sit and really focus on something for 5 minutes, then you may be able to sit for 5 minutes and write an essay. You may be able to sit for 5 minutes and intently, like, create something, paint something, and so on. So while there are crossovers of that attentionality, it does not change your rewire your brain. It does not change your brain for the better. It does not make you a better um, more intelligent person or smarter person. It doesn't enhance your cognitive foundation so much, which is, I guess, your question about myelination. So
Fair
music
enough.
and
So
myelination is an unwritten book.
fair enough.
Which
So
needs
one last question before we end the podcast. So we started on music. I want to end at music. Again, as a trained singer musician, Mm, what do you think is the state of classical music? I know it's a very cliched question, is because I'm passionate about classical music. I listen to a lot of folk music, which is semi-classical, not purely classical, but it does have elements of classical music. Like my background, I like Wadali brothers, for example. I like to listen to
Mm,
Wadali brothers. I love
mm.
listening to them. But what do you think is the state? It doesn't matter if it's Carnatic or Hindustani, just classical music in general. So I'll give you an example. I had shared the same example, if I remember correctly, with Sona Mahapatra in my podcast with her. So Pandit Shiv Kumar Sharma, I think he passed away recently, a few months ago, if I remember correctly. So he had said in an interview, he's like, where he mentions that ragas are supposed to be sung at particular hours, right? Right, you have
Mhm.
morning ragas, evening ragas, whatever specific time slots. He's like, today if I sing that morning raga, right, how many people are going to turn up? So how do I make, so for you, as a person who is actively involved in this, where are you on this debate? Like Panditji said that, look, I would still want to sing in the morning, but nowadays if I go somewhere and I'm performing and somebody requests that rag which actually is supposed to be sung
Hmm.
in the morning,
Morning.
in the afternoon or the evening, I will sometimes do it, albeit regrettingly. So where do you stand in this discussion?
So at I have a small laboratory called the Music, Brain, and Creativity Lab, and this was the first question we asked in sort of in this plexus of neuroscience and music, because the time theory in Hindustani classical music is very strong, and it's the elephant in the room. So when you listen to, let's say, a bhairav, do you really hear the morning? And if you say I'm hearing the morning in bhairav, what is actually giving you the idea of morning? Is it the Komal Rishabh, or is it the way in which Hari Prasad Chaurasia ji, like, gently touches that in a very plaintive way? So is it really the swara? Is it really the intervals? Or is it the way in which the alap is like really nicely unfurled, just like the unfurling of the dawn? Or is it the timbre of the flute itself? So we did this very short experiment. We scrambled samples of Hindustani classical ragas, morning, evening ragas, and we asked people who had no sense of the time theory, or they were not musicians, so they had no idea of the praharas and the ragas and so on. So we played these samples to them, set of three samples, and we asked them, well, which one of these is, according to you, signals the morning, the afternoon, and the evening, and why? And so we were also looking at valence, like, what do people really see when they say, I feel this is a morning raga, or I feel this is an evening raga? Because it's an objective. The layman on the street, does he really hear it as a morning raga, or is it just it's an idiom that is shared by a few musicologists and musicians? And strangely, what we realized was that most of them are all over the place. We asked painters, we looked at visual artists, Carnatic musicians, and just people on the street, and we said, okay, which feels like morning to you? So strangely, people said, this feels like evening for a morning raga. People associated emotions with ragas, like, happy, sad, meditative, plaintive, but never mapped it to time. They couldn't associate time very intuitively as they associated emotions to, like, certain samples. And strangely, everything that Hariji played, Hari Prasad Chauresa plays on his flute, sounds meditative to everybody. So we realize that it is the timbre, or that sonority, or the quality of the instrument from which that raga is heard or sounded, that actually is the deal breaker. It can actually sing in the morning or drown the evening. And so there is really no what do you say, general neuroaesthetic consensus on that. But as a musician myself, the Carnatic classical tradition really does not follow the morning evening ragas. And I personally feel that it is so much in the hands of the musician to nuance. I look at the Bollywood composers, for example, Yahoo, chahe koi mujhe jangli kahe, कहने दो जे कहता रहे. You think that's in a, what raga do you think that's in? It's in one of the most plaintive minor scales of Indian music. So lyric, presentation, orchestration, the rhythm in which the raga is presented, they are so much more powerful than just the ragas and the swaras and their intervals. So there's so much in the hands of the composer, the performer, that he can really take the music away, or a raga away from its intended or ascribed rasa, so to speak. So I think that's, like I said, it's neither black and white, it's somewhere in the middle.
Fair enough. I personally, I think just I'm not a trained singer in any comparison, but I just feel that as someone who enjoys classical music, whether Carnatic or Hindustani or even semi-classical, whether it's in the form of any lok geet uh, from any part of the country, I just think uh, sometimes you got to break the rules to make sure it stays alive. It's more a utilitarian approach. I guess in my case it's more about realism, like let's make sure something stays alive. And I guess if that means sometimes we have to sing in the evening, morning raga in the evening, I think there is nothing wrong in it. But yeah, this has been an absolutely wonderful experience talking to you. First of all, thanks for coming and writing this wonderful book. So what next project, if you could tell us?
Well, from the desk, I guess I'm now looking at the intercultural encounters of music in the Mysore court. So I'm that's the next book on how Mysore subverted coloniality into a culture of cultural resilience. So that's the next book. I'm also sort of the biography. I've been bitten hard by the biography bug. I realized that there is not a biography of Nalbadi Krishnaraja Wadiyar, the Maharaja's uncle, who was known as the Rajarshi. And so, like I said, it's one thing to say, sit and cry foul that there is not enough of this positive stories floating around, positive psychology on the Rajas floating around, and that we are only documenting invaders. I want to actually sort of get down and write more and create more literature in that domain. So that's what's coming up next. As a musician, I'm interested in cultural diplomacy. That's my next project. I'm looking at how our music, classical music, can be used as an agency to connect global communities. Um, so, like a Kanakadasa meets Rumi, and Kabir meets Kuvempu, things like that.
Awesome. Awesome. I really look forward to it. And once again, thank you very much for coming and chatting with me over here. I wish you nothing but success. And, this is fun. I always, it is always nice to talk to people who are way more talented than me. At least, I know what I can aspire to be.
No, I would not accept that. Kushalji, you have really, 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 it's an art to actually bring out the best from each one of your interviewees. And I've felt the joy of being in some very safe, adroit hands. Thank you so much for inviting me on to this show. And I look forward to more such associations with you.
Oh yes, we definitely are going to speak again. I'm going to try to do something where I'll maybe organize a music discussion where I'll have you, I'll have some other people. I want
Oh,
to I
yes.
want to do that. I've already thought of what I'm going to do. I'm going to share it with you when we go offline. I'm going to try working around with that. But guys, before we wrap things up, once again, in the description of the podcast, if you're watching this on YouTube or you're listening on Spotify, iTunes, जो भी ऑडियो प्लेटफॉर्म्स होते हैं, go and check the description. In the description you will see Dr. Navratna's website. You can go and check that website out, and it will have her YouTube channel, the Facebook page, everything else. Also in the description you will have a link to buy the book. I would recommend all of you to go and buy the book. And as far as I'm concerned, you know the drill. The Cārvāka podcast is a member driven podcast, so if you can support me, become a member on Fanmo, YouTube, Patreon, or buy the merch. Subscribe to this channel, like this video, leave your comments over in the comment section. I'll see you guys next time. Until then, namaste, take care, bye bye.
Namaste.